Hey everybody, welcome to another GG WoW video. I'm Dratnos, joined by M Plus expert Dorki, M Plus expert Ellesmere, and my good personal friend Tettles. We're going to start by talking about some of the changes and thoughts we have just about Mythic Plus, this expansion, next expansion, I think really something we're wanting to look at because we all love Mythic Plus, and there have been a lot of interesting changes that have been made to it since it's come out, and we all have ideas on more interesting changes that could be made to it to keep it going forward. And also we've heard about some changes that are already on the way for this. So when we're kind of organizing our thoughts for this, the first topic that kind of I think all four of us have strong opinions on is Tyrannical and Fortified, the level 2 affixes. Ellesmere, how about you? Would you like to take a first swing at what are your thoughts on the state of Tyrannical and Fortified right now?
I think Fortified and Tyrannical originally were created to add variants from week to week in Mythic Plus. I think somewhere along the way, though, affixes got variant enough, and with the introduction of seasonal affixes as well, that we kind of lost the need for that extra layer of variants from Fortified and Tyrannical. And at this current state, I think all that Fortified and Tyrannical do, I don't think they really have much purpose because we're in an infinitely scaling system already, and Fortified and Tyrannical don't really do anything except scale it further. The whole point of Fortified and Tyrannical is to create 1 week where you're focused more on trash, and then the next week where you're focused more on bosses. But the problem with that is that what it's kind of become is 1 week where trash is like a complete joke and bosses take 10 minutes, and then another week where trash is really difficult and bosses are complete jokes. And so I think that either they would have to reduce the scaling of Fortified and Tyrannical significantly in order to ease that balance, or better yet, just get rid of them entirely, which would create a really good balance of both trash and bosses being difficult every week. It's not really fun to go into keys and just blow through bosses in a minute and a half, and then the next week you spend 10 minutes on them, in my opinion. And I think a big problem that Fortified and Tyrannical created was that, I don't know, it's hard to weigh in as somebody who pushes really high keys. I have a very different experience from somebody who plays M+ more casually. Like, obviously, for world first keys, Tyrannical is a huge problem because of the infinite scaling system and the fact that the damage profiles of bosses just get to the level where things start becoming impossible because you just get one shot. And then you're having to do weird shit like stack versatility and avoidance just so that you will live those one shots. And it becomes less about like outplaying the dungeon and more just about trying to not get one shot by mechanics.
So I actually have a question then. So like, I don't know if I fully agree. I do agree that like Tyrannical and Fortified at least feels bad to play, but is it only that we're doing like high enough level keys to where there is a strict dichotomy between the two affix sets? Maybe is it like
about to stay the same?
Yeah,
because like I agree with a lot of points where you're saying how it does become an issue, mostly for the top end players, where we run into the borders of the infinite scaling. Right, we get to the point where Zav starts to one shot, but this doesn't really occur to most players. And in fact, I feel like it's still a really big deal having Fortified and Tyrannical. Like, I know you were saying how, it's like less of a big deal with having all these new affixes. I don't necessarily agree, because us dedicating our resources more towards trash on Fortified, or like, weeks where it's Tyrannical and we're just allowed to pull bigger, I feel like that adds a lot of flavor to the game. The real issue is, like you've said, we don't like doing 10-minute long bosses, especially when they don't have nearly as many mechanics as an actual Mythic raid boss. And like even in the 15 to 20 keys I've done in Pugs, bosses can take up to 5 minutes, like the first boss of Mist, for example. But the entire time you're just beating on a tree and you're just doing some basic kicks, dodging swirlies. There's not enough complexity compared to something like, an actual Mythic raid boss that makes it fun to do a 5-minute plus boss.
Yeah. My thought process is, the thing that I've been thinking about is, the hard mode versions of like Tazavesh, Mechagon, those bosses that have like a mechanical twist that's actually pretty intense on a few of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are
What
actually
if
fun.
what if instead of tyrannical, it was just like instead of extra boss health and damage, it was just
They
like a
get new
hard mode
mechanics, right?
mechanic. And then it doesn't necessarily add that much time to the encounters. It just increases the like lethality and difficulty of the fights, but it means that those hard mode things that they, especially for the mega dungeons, it always feels so bad that those are like something you only ever experience on M0 and then never do an M+.
I will say though, I've been thinking about this a little bit lately. Most of my enjoyment for Mythic Plus dungeons comes through like trash. Like not even through the bosses. I feel like more often than not, I've landed on the philosophy of like bosses can be okay in the dungeon. Very infrequently do they add to the fun in the dungeon, in my personal experience, and the trash is like almost all of my enjoyment there. And so I do, at least on that level, think that like tyrannical versus fortified, it's weird because it's like less of like a tyrannical versus fortified thing and more like a design principle thing. But at the same point, like the longer that I'm spending fighting the bosses, it's just like in general, the less I'm having fun, like big pulling the trash or whatever.
Yeah, completely agreed. But again, that's like something on the whole dungeon and design aspect,
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
guess we can go into a little bit later.
Yeah, I think before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about some of the other affixes that are going on. I think for this, rather than necessarily like listing all of them, I want to say that I think the changes made this expansion to most of the affixes have been really good. Like if you remember the changes that were made to storming, to explosive, where everybody just like one shots them now, to grievous, where like healers can remove ticks by just
Yeah.
casting heals on people. I think almost all of those have been really good. And the thing about that is they've moved the affixes towards being easier. And like, I feel like it's counterintuitive because people, especially we get these comments that are like, why do these people always want the game to be easier, right? But it's like, we want the affixes to be less impactful so that we can do the keys like at a higher level and have those dungeon mechanics themselves be like, what is ceiling? What's the ceiling? What's the wall that we're bashing our heads into rather than like, this affix is killing me, right?
I think it's less about making the affixes easier and more about creating more room for outplaying the affixes, essentially. A lot of their changes have been, I mean, obviously part of it, by creating more room for outplay, you are making it easier, but the goal of it isn't just to simplify the affix, it's to give you a way to outplay it. Whether we're talking about necrotic, being able to outplay it by, spreading out your heals so that you're constantly removing stacks, or if we're talking about bolstering, being able to now still do some of these big pulls, but manage when you're bolstering mobs and, when that bolstering is going to fall off and when you want to swap damage to which mobs because of that. They've made a lot of these changes. And then also like storming, for example, like you can have your healer soak storming now, or your tank soak storming, depending on what the situation is. If, somebody's trying to channel and earn in DOS, you can like take the storms for them so that they can get the channel off. Most of these changes have been all about creating room for outplay on affixes, which I think is really, really good. And it's really important that that philosophy kind of gets shifted from just affixes that make your life miserable to affixes that make your life miserable, but there are ways to outplay them.
From like a player perspective, is there a way to really make the affixes feel okay? So like I know for storming, it went from being really obnoxious to like a fairly solid affix, but with bolstering and necrotic, like and honestly kind of inspiring too, they've reached this point where I don't know even like how they make those affixes not just feel worse than some of the other weeks to the point where players aren't willing to play.
Yeah, like I agree with you guys where it's not about the difficulty. Like I know Dratnos was bringing up about how certain affixes are difficult. I feel like a lot of players wouldn't mind difficulty, and in fact, they would probably enjoy having extra added difficulty to the dungeon. It's more so how punishing and how unfun they can be to play. I think a prime example is the Sanguine Necrotic week we just had. Wait, no, that's not Sanguine. What did we have last
Spiteful.
week?
It was Spiteful
Necrotic,
Necrotic, wasn't it?
Spiteful Necrotic. That's
Spiteful
what it was.
Necrotic, yeah.
Like that's a prime example of a week
Epic.
that is not necessarily difficult because like you see people timing really high keys that week. It was like 29s and 30s. It was just extremely unfun to play. The amount of tanks that come into my chat, or just like people in general that come into my chat who are like, I refuse to play this week, even if it's not necessarily a hard week. I feel like that just goes to show how it's more about the fun factor, not necessarily about how easy or hard it is.
Is
And I
it?
feel like the best way of engaging it, like it's like you said, I don't know how to deal with
Yeah.
bolstering and inspiring stuff. Yeah, I do agree with you, but I feel like maybe a better solution would be to make them more rewarding to play. I don't know if you guys have heard me talk about this on Max's stream, but we talked about this a little bit, and I was saying how one really fun idea would be, what if we just had affixes that would reward players for doing them? Like inspiring, for example. What if we made it so that if you kill an inspiring mob, it would demoralize all the mobs around? That sounds like it would be fun as hell, right? Like, you would be able to think
Yeah.
about all the different things you can do from week to week. Like let's say one week you'd be like, oh man, it's inspiring. I'm actually looking forward to this. I can pull the inspired mob by itself, get it low, and then pull it onto like a massive pull and just kill it and murder everything that takes like, some X amount of increased damage, or if they do less damage. I feel like that'd be fun, even if it might not be exactly easiest or hardest affix.
Well, we actually had an iteration of that in season 2 with explosive. So people would take the
Oh, I know what you're
bolstering.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, people would take the bolstering thing from one of the torment dudes, which would give them increased damage anytime an enemy died. And it had an interaction with explosive where anytime you killed an explosive, that would give everyone a stack. So it created this system where explosive now was that kiss curse style thing where, yeah, you had to deal with explosive, but anytime you killed an explosive, your group got a damage buff. So because of that, everybody actually looked forward to explosive week, and it was kind of a push week. I mean, everyone looked forward to it because the healers were still going to do all the work for explosives, but that's a different topic. But yeah, I mean, I fully agree with Dorki. I think that a kiss curse style system, Blizzard started exploring that with seasonal affixes back in BFA, and I think that they really it's obvious that they liked it after they started iterating all the new seasonal affixes towards this kiss curse style thing with Prideful, with relics and last season too. And I think that creating or migrating that system over to regular affixes as well would be a great thing, but I would get a little concerned with just the power spike that you might see, or the borrowed power that you might be getting if every single affix had a positive element to it as well. I think the Kiss Curse style affix system is good, but I wouldn't want 3 affixes where all 3 of them were giving us positive benefits, because I feel like there would be too much power being gained from those affixes.
Yeah, I mean, just looking
Yeah.
at it logistically, like the second affix set are generally your on death affixes, so it's like bursting, raging, inspiring, spiteful, bolstering, sanguine. Like you could add a positive effect to all of these, but at the same point, is that like legitimately a solution? I don't know. Like
I
it
think-
is
I think
definitely
the
something
bigger
that could be
thing-
done.
I think the bigger thing is to just have less affixes too, to be honest. I feel like having 2 affixes might just be a little bit too much. I feel even just having 1 affix per week would be enough to add a lot of
Okay.
flavor to the game. And also, I don't necessarily agree with the whole power spiking thing, because also, like, it's not necessarily a kiss curse thing. Like, I know kiss curse would be fun, but at the same time, it could just be reward rather than punishment. If we look at something like, let's look at the seasonal affixes. There was Encrypted, which has probably been the most fun seasonal affix we've had since probably Awaken, right? I think most people would agree with that.
Yeah.
I've asked a lot of people, and a lot of people would have us agreed in my chat. The big thing with Encrypted is, think about it for a second. This is the only seasonal affix we've had where we don't proactively try to skip the seasonal affix. We're like, oh, how can we get more relics? How do we get this relic pack? Like, what are ways we can engage this relic pack? And it's actually been fun to do the relics. Even though they've been giving us a bunch of buffs throughout the dungeon, I feel like we're not getting like massive power spike from Encrypted.
Yeah, I've had this thought as well, because Prideful and particularly some of the tougher tormentors, right? It's like, oh, these are legitimately mini bosses that are potentially harder than like, or more throughput intensive than some of the bosses in these dungeons, right? And it's just like, this scales pretty poorly into a 29 keystone setting, right? But I understand why they want those to be like impactful in a plus 15 key, right? When you think about a Prideful spawning in a plus 15 key, that's not, you don't get any of those problems of like, oh, we want to skip this. Oh, this is not something that like numerically we can handle. So I think that something about Prideful and Tormented, like if they want to do those mini boss style affixes again, I think there's a lot of good reasons to do that, right? I think it's a cool, weapon in the arsenal of the seasonal affixes. But I think they should develop the technology to have them scale at a slower rate than the rest of the dungeon, so that they can set them at that point where they are dangerous and interesting in a plus 15, and then don't become more powerful than the bosses in a plus 29.
Well, something that seasonal affixes run into is also like specifically those that contain like lieutenant mobs. They're just less interesting than the ones that are kind of like encrypted or awakened, where you really do have a lot more freedom with what you're doing.
Is that the biggest reason why we've been liking encrypted more? Is it just because the mini bosses are nowhere near as hard? Because I mean,
think a lot of it has to do with
it,
difficulty.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a lot of it.
The power you get from the 2 affixes before were actually really nice. Like tormented powers are really nice. Same with prideful power.
It's just you never had cooldowns because you had to use your cooldown to skill the pride.
I mean, that's what I meant about like the whole like kiss curse thing. Like, I wouldn't say it's necessarily kiss curse, because I'd rather it just be a straight up kiss. Like the encrypted, for example. It just feels like it's a straight up buff, right? Like you never really feel the need to skip an encrypted pack.
Yeah, I will say I don't think they have to be like that. Like I loved Reaping, and Reaping just gave you mobs that didn't give you any benefit.
Okay, I mean, but you were one of those dumb DPS at the time, Dratnos.
I'm still one of those.
Yeah. I know everyone always talks fondly about Reaping, but come on, man. I liked Reaping too, but it felt like it was kind of a non-affix.
That's my if I could replace Tyrannical with hard mode, I would do replace Fortified with Reaping. That would be my
that would be
pitch.
Cool,
actually.
Yeah. Well, I miss it so bad. Let's move on to talk a little bit about dungeon design now, because I think that's something that is important, and often I think it kind of shapes your thoughts about the other things, right? Like sometimes dungeon design, we see like when we do these Legion time walking weeks, how much the same everything else can feel pretty different in just a world of very different dungeon design. So I want to start by talking a little bit about linear versus non-linear versus that kind of. It's a discussion point that I think people just throw out fairly often, using words like linear versus non-linear dungeons. Does anyone have a take on what the... Okay, Tettles has a take. Go for
yes,
it.
I do. Okay, so first off, yes. Generally speaking, I prefer non-linear dungeons, but it's more because like the things that I like about Mythic Plus the most is the level of creativity that you can implement into keys, and more often than not, in dungeons that feel more tubular in nature, just like there's only a couple of different variable paths that you can take, that really stunts creativity in my mind. And it's like you have to have that level of creativity in dungeons to kind of facilitate cool things. So think about the dungeons that more often than not people end up enjoying the most. Halls of Atonement and Freehold are the ones from like the most like the 2 recent expansions that if you ask, generally people are going to be more fond of. What do these things have in common? They have trash that's like relatively easy to deal with, but the biggest thing too is that like you're never going to run the same route really twice, because you don't have to. And so even though there are like pretty good templates for things like Halls of Atonement and for Freehold for like which packs you really want to pull, if you go in there with a bunch of different pugs, you're never going to pull the same packs twice, because the dungeon is so open and everybody kind of has a different take on like how you're going to be doing the dungeon. And that's why I think that by design, you should be like the developers should be more focused on making dungeons that have better potential to facilitate different pulls, different routing, and like facilitate different changes just over the course of a whole entire dungeon. Because as we've seen, the more strict dungeons with difficult boss encounters, things like King's Rest, those are the ones that have been liked the least, because there's not enough room for creativity where players really believe that they have stuff to do. And in addition to that, like these just become rogue mandatory dungeons or like Invis-Pot mandatory dungeons, and players also hate that. Like even on like a 15 level, players hate the I have to bring an invisibility potion to dungeons. I don't feel like I have really control over what I'm pulling. And so for me, that's why Blizzard really needs to fixate and focus on making dungeons more open, but it's from like a creative level, not only from just a design art level.
Yeah, I agree. Well, this also ties into class balance a little bit, but I feel like the best way to approach this would probably be to create different paths you can take that allow for specific comps, because that would probably be the most fun way of having a variety of different paths. Because like eventually you'll have the point where you have paths that are just the best, just simply because they have the most easy mobs and they give the best count, right? Like Freehold, for example, you always pull X amount of mobs going this way. Like you would never, like the beginning of Freehold, for example, you would never go right. That was like maybe something people experimented with in the beginning, but they never. Yeah, like I mean, who the hell even knows what's there? I feel like the best
Yeah.
way would, yeah, the best way would be to have. What if they just made it so that certain classes just excelled at certain areas? If we look at the other side, for example, in the whole Mana Storm area, I don't understand why there are mobs that have like the most awful cast in the game that give you 5 count and you're only able to fight them one at a time. What if instead, there were still one mob and they gave you way more count and you had classes that just excelled at killing these singular mobs? That way we can create like a better class. That way we have ways of bringing different variety of DPS too. There's no reason where specific specs, like a Feral Druid, for example, they're great at single target. Why not make them arguably the best at single target by a lot? Well, I mean, I guess this would be like, a bit of a whole talk about the whole class balance, considering this is more of a raid versus M plus thing.
Yeah, I think a good example, like even the Tazavesh Streets of Wonder, the left path versus the right path, with the left path having like the mini bosses and the the big lieutenant mobs, and the right pack having like dangerous big pull. I think is like a good idea. We could argue about whether the tuning is such that you actually do consider the two paths equally and decide based on your comp. And we also, I think, have just M plus skews so much towards AoE that you rarely show up with a comp of like single target damage dealers. But I look back at dungeons like Underrot, where it's like, okay, yeah, the dungeon is linear, right? It's a line, but there's like the left pull, the right pull in every room, basically, that you get to choose between which one you're going to do. You can choose to like skip at the start of the dungeon, kill trash at the start of the dungeon, skip later in the dungeon, kill the trash there. And also you can just walk in a straight line and not go too far over count, which I think is something that's really good about it's since Legion, the change where it's like if you don't ever press an invis pot, aside from like Temple of Sithralis, there hasn't been a dungeon since Legion where you would go to 150% count and be super inefficient if you just held W, which is good. I think that's important for like weekly 15s.
Yeah, they just need more bonus mobs added.
Yeah, exactly.
Just,
Like
literally
good,
just like slap on a bunch of useless mobs onto
like a Taldazar Honor Guards or Zolramus Gatekeepers and Necrotic Wake are, I think, really ones that should get changed as soon as they're kind of identified as like, nobody is ever pulling this mob ever unless they've made a mistake. Like that's those are mobs that should get either more count or less dangerous, less health, like something like that, so that they're an option, right? Obviously there's always going to be a best and a worst path, but I think you want to move the worst stuff to be less bad, to the point where, yeah, if you've got a comp, if you've got cooldown timings that justify it, you wouldn't just immediately discount the possibility of ever pulling those mobs.
How have you guys felt
Yeah,
about
they
Streets
did
and
a-
Gambit?
Well, I was about to say they actually did a great job with making a lot of those adjustments really quickly in
Yeah.
Streets and Gambit. Their initial iterations were very different from what we're currently experiencing, but they were super fast to address all those problems. And I think that same level of attention to these problems would be nice to see on some of the dungeons that have been around for more of Shadowlands. Like you were saying, with like gatekeepers, rage masks, and DOS, all those like outlier things that you try to avoid as much as you can, because they are just like either A, not worth it at all from a count perspective, or B, just like super dangerous. I think it's okay if they're dangerous and they give a lot of count, but when they're dangerous and they don't give much count, that should be addressed quickly, which they did a great job of in Tazvesh. But yeah, some of the other dungeons could use some looking at.
Yeah, especially dungeons like Spires. Spires, we've been going the right path the entire time. Yeah, from season
Yeah.
1 until now, I have not changed my route a single time. Maybe like very
Yeah.
small variations, but that has been the one dungeon where you always go in the exact same path. You have to fight certain mobs. There's like no way around it, and then you get your count from certain areas. And there are just so many non-fightable packs in that dungeon.
Yeah. Another example is Plaguefall, the first area. Like, it is extremely rare that you ever go left.
Yeah. The bees.
Yeah.
Do you guys even know what they do? I mean, I feel like most people have not seen them, even if you're like a high level player. And it's like, what do they
There's
even
like a
do?
hive that like spawns infinitely until you kill it. It's like spawns ads. It's
There's
not
also
good.
plague borers that don't explode.
Yeah. A few of those.
That's fun.
Another thing about Plaguefall in particular that I think is kind of interesting, there's been some dungeons this expansion that have the, disease or poison dispels or curse dispels even that have been somewhere on the spectrum from like, this is nice to, this is really good if we have a disease dispel in here. How do you all feel about the value of those different, not always like obviously the magic dispels are normal, right? But the other dispels that not all the healers have.
I'm gonna say something that's probably gonna upset people, but
Oh,
I
no.
think that
The Holy Paladin take.
I
Go
think
ahead.
that
True.
all healers should have the ability to get rid of any of those things. What I would like to see is the talent system in Dragonflight. What I'd like to see is all the specs, like paladins can have one of those talent trees be now you have a decurse. I would like to see that talent tree expanded to allow healers to opt in to being able to handle all of that. So that way you don't have to like build your comps from dungeon to dungeon around, like, because right now there are certain dungeons like halls, for example. If you don't have a decurse in halls, you just die, like, unless
No, wait, hold up.
like,
But I think
well,
that's a good thing, though. That adds
I got-
diversity, because like
I know,
I
and that's why I said it's going to upset people, because I know that a lot of people think
yeah.
that forces people onto multi-classing and playing different specs, which I think is a good thing. But also for like the average player, I feel like for the average player, it's not fun that you have to like swap classes just to be able to do certain dungeons.
Well,
But I could be totally wrong.
the average player is grabbing people out of LFG. So
Yeah,
they'll just
yeah. So,
grab a
you have
different
to-
dispel.
Yeah, they'll just not take specific classes. Well, yeah, like that way.
Yeah,
they
but
would
that's
at
not
least
fun
have-
either. Like if
Yeah.
you're like a
But I mean, you know
paladin
how, like,
healer
certain-
trying to get into halls and they're like, nope, we need a shaman.
Yeah, but think
I-
about it from the underdog's perspective. What if you were like a Mistweaver and you're like, oh man, this is like finally my shot to get into a key because I bring this specific thing.
Well, that's a whole different conversation that we should have about tuning and the fact that some
Yeah.
specs
Whoa,
are
whoa, whoa.
wildly better than others. But I don't think we
Here's
we're
my
getting
take
into that
on
quite yet.
on poison curse disease is like, I think if you look at like Theater of Pain curses, right? Like the Portal Guardian curse that makes somebody take a lot of extra shadow damage, but like you don't need a curse spell, right? The curse where it's like, oh, if you don't have a curse spell, this person's gonna have to move because they're dropping purple swirlies under their feet. I feel like those curses, I feel like the Awakened Mob curse, where it was like, oh, this fears you, but if you've got a curse spell, you don't have to deal with it, right? I like the I like those sorts of places for this sort of dispel that not everybody's gonna have, where it's like, it's nice, but it's not like night and day, people are gonna die. And then
Yeah,
I feel like
that's the real
Plaguefall,
issue. Yeah.
like disease dispel and Plaguefall is where I'm just like, we're gonna have
Yes,
some
I-
bodies hit the floor, right?
I 100% agree with that. I guess my only problem with those, curses and stuff, now that you mention it, was specifically the ones that if you didn't have, you died.
Yeah.
Like the ones that literally forced you into it.
Well,
And I think I wouldn't care if, you had a group full of people that couldn't do it, as long as there was a way to outplay it, even if it was much more difficult.
just as a complete counterpoint, I literally got invited to a 26 Halls of Atonement like last week because somebody needed a decurse.
because of the curse.
It was strictly because of the decurse.
That's exactly what I'm saying though. Like I feel like it adds to reasons why you would bring specific classes. Let's look at BFA and Legion, for example. They didn't really have things that you had to dispel. Like, what was the biggest thing you had to dispel in Legion or BFA, I should say?
BFA Underrot disease dispel was pretty big.
Yeah.
Underrot
What
disease dispel was like
Mandatory. There was the
mandatory.
stun, right?
Oh yeah, but that's like
Oh,
something
yeah,
that you
yeah, I
can
remember
counterplay, right?
that.
Yeah, like it
Yeah.
didn't feel
You
mandatory.
could kick it
at
or
all.
dispel it, right?
You could CC
Yeah,
it.
I don't remember
OCC,
playing-
yeah.
Yeah, we never played with a disease dispel, and it has not been an issue. However, if you run to Plaguefall, for example, a 30-second debuff from any of these little guys
Yeah.
that stacks multiple times, that
Your
that
take
is
has 2
too
HP.
much. Yeah. That is way too much.
Yeah.
But that goes into the whole class thing.
I think they could be, like maybe less impactful than Plaguefall, more impactful than some of the other spots. So it's like, yeah, we'd like a curse dispel, but we could still play with that one. Or like Ellesmere said, just give it to all the healers and find a different way to make sure that Mistweavers can get invited.
You have to be careful with homogenization, though.
I
Yeah.
agree. You do have to be
Tettles.
careful with homogenization. I agree.
I do think one really big thing that we didn't talk about yet is how the length of the dungeons. We need to stray away from longer dungeons because I feel like there's not a lot of people who enjoy longer dungeons. Also, it punishes players who just want to be able to do a quick key, whether you have a schedule or whatnot.
Yeah.
Because we definitely have dungeons that are on the long side, being like 40 something minutes long, and then we have dungeons that are 30 minutes long, and that's been generally been what people enjoy. If you look at dungeons like Mist, Gambit, Ataldazar, Freehold, even Ball of Souls, they've always been one of the better
Wait.
dungeons because of how short they are.
Yeah.
And
I've been thinking about this as well. Like when you do exclamation point keys in your group and you just see like Mist, and you're like happy. But it's not
yeah,
necessarily
you always
because you
look
like
oh, let's do the short ones.
it's not like it's not necessarily because like, oh, you like the dungeon mechanically. It's like, I can get in and out of here, 20 minutes faster. Like that sounds great. So I agree. I think they should standardize and standardize down to that like 30-minute average.
I don't mean to derail real quick, but how have you guys felt about Covenant buffs and dungeons this expansion?
I don't know, actually.
I'm fine with
like-
them with
okay.
swappables.
I think that some of them are good. I don't like the ones that are extremely dominant and like play the game for you, basically. Like I think Necrotic Wake
Yeah.
has way too much of that kind of stuff, whether it's just from the weapons on the ground and then also the Goliath, and between everything, like I don't think there should be that much borrowed power sitting in a dungeon that kind of just like you roll your way through from that. So I think the Covenant perks that are less impactful are fine, but I don't like the ones that are super, super impactful.
But is that because of having to have the Covenant, or is that just because of how they affect the dungeon way too much? Because I mean, like the weapons, for example,
me, it's
are not a
because of how
Kyrian
they affect
specific
the
thing.
dungeon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's more of like a Toll de Gore sort of thing.
Right. I had a problem with the Covenant stuff for like the Covenant reasons back before we could swap them. Now it's just a case of like, I agree. It's the same thing as Toll de Gore cannons, right? Where it's just like, or Kyrian weapons, the ones that you don't need the Covenant for, even in Necrotic Wake, where it's just like these kind of like they play the dungeon for you. The dungeon kind of revolves around whether you're making good use of them. It's not about my damage. The scaling of the dungeon is kind of wonky because the key level goes up, but the damage that the spears do go up as well. So it sort of is scaling weird. All of those are things where, I tend to prefer the dungeons where there's none of that stuff. And it's just, if a mob's going to die, it's because I killed it.
Yeah, like Mists, for example, is pretty minimal in terms of the impact that it has on the dungeon. I mean, release point is a whole separate thing that we can talk about, but I just mean like the flowers, for example. Like it's a nice buff, it gives you something, but it doesn't. It's not like the dungeon isn't revolvent around that.
How about something like Sanguine Depths? I personally like it a lot, but what are you guys' opinion on it? Where you have this massive buff that you can get if you play around it really smartly, and you just go from like urn to urn. That has been like a really fun one for me.
Yeah, I think that design was really great. The way that they did it, and the fact that like you are playing around it, but also like it's fun to play around. It's not just like hucking a spear or sitting there in melee with an orb that does 1 billion damage. It's something that you actively have to like play around and control. And I don't know. I enjoy Sanguine Depths because of those lanterns, for sure. I agree with you.
Yeah, I feel like the lanterns are really good ones for like coordinated high-end groups as well, because like you said, there's a huge opportunity for skill expression with extending the buff, right? Getting onto the next one quickly, having a cool plan for them. So I mean, Dorki, you in particular, whenever I watch you in that dungeon, you're just always doing something different and really good with the lanterns, and it's really fun to watch.
It's really fun. You're always thinking about how you can route around it too.
Yeah,
they create a lot of unique routes because of the power burst that you get from them and the different things that you can do with it, which is something we were talking about earlier with affixes.
And it just buffs your characters as well.
Yes,
it's not like doing the
exactly,
damage.
yeah.
That's what I was about to say. It's like it's a player specific character buff as opposed to like, okay, so I mean, if you look at Necrotic Wake, I'm sure the effective power is probably similar to what the Sanguine Depths effective power is from the lanterns versus the Kyrian weapons, maybe a little bit worse, but at least the damage is coming from my character inside of my CDs, so you have to at least plan and play the dungeon.
Yeah. And anytime it's like I'm getting a stat buff or something like that, I agree. Those feel like the kind of things where, at the end of the day, it adds even more of like multiplying it with my cooldowns, those kinds of things to get value out of it, rather than
the better you play, the better it's going to be.
And it's still good for, it's not like, I mean, the lanterns, I think obviously they're like a lot less impactful for like a weekly 15 than, maybe a Kyrian spear onto a boss or something is, but I think they still work pretty well in those settings where you're not like min-maxing them as hard as we do. So yeah, I think that's a really good type of gimmick to have in a dungeon compared to the Toldagor, the Necrotic Wake style. Do we want to talk a little bit about, let's see, so we've still got class balance rewards and like mop and wad dungeons to potentially talk about. Maybe want to pick one as a next topic going once.
Well, considering we know for sure we are getting the whole mop wad dungeons, I guess we can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Tettles, I know you have been looking through the mop and wad dungeons,
Yes.
trying to figure out how they're going to play for M+. What's your take on adding these to the M+ pool? And also just like, is there anything you'd want to see done to them, done with them? Any specific ones you'd want to see them choose or avoid?
I think that Blizzard has to be incredibly careful with the Mists of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor dungeons that they're picking in particular. In addition to that, like, okay, so first off, a lot of the dungeons have some of the stuff that players, at least in my experience, have hated. At least I know that I don't like, whether it be high amounts of RP, really weird gimmicks in dungeons, or just like there's a lack of creativity that you can realistically do during some of the trash pulls. And this is, I'm kind of worried about Grimrail Depot, by the way, because of the on the rails nature of the train. But like, so for me, I think that something that Blizzard should be looking to do whenever they're bringing them back is not to just like immediately convert them to Mythic Plus dungeons, but there should be some things that they do to kind of change the dungeon from what it once was, and like modernize it, whether that be maybe adding some more trash mechanics, maybe changing some of the bosses, cutting some of the RP that's like present in those Mists of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor dungeons. For me, I think the dungeon that I thought that was like almost by far the most interesting was like Siege of New Zhao. I don't know how many people in here played it during MOP. I didn't even play during MOP, but Siege of New Zhao was this weird dungeon, and they have slimes at the beginning of it, and they give you a stacking damage buff. That's really cool. The dungeon is also relatively open in a weird way, where the pathing is kind of cool, but there's a massive downside where there's like a second boss that summons like adds and waves. And while I think the dungeon is cool, the second boss was so bad that it would be almost to a detriment to the dungeon. But like if they were willing to rework the second boss, or willing to rework some of the trash in some of these other dungeons, I think that that is the way that the developers should take the legacy content in the dungeons and look through them. And that's how I think that they could also bring back some dungeons from like Wrath and Kata as well, and like add those into Mythic Plus rotation. Of course, it would take a little bit of time to modernize them in a couple of ways, adding some mechanics and whatnot. But overall, it would be faster and better than having to completely make a new dungeon from scratch. So there's definitely something to be said about that.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is, keep the assets, just rework it and modernize everything. I am definitely worried about that as well, considering, that's going to be like the biggest thing I'll be playing. I am hoping that going into next season and even next expansion, the dungeons we're getting won't be not anything like we've expected in the past 2 years.
I will say, I am concerned about the seasonality of Mythic Plus dungeons. So like something that we saw with Legion Time Walking is players just kind of forewent playing the Legion Time Walking dungeons in general. Okay, so first off, they're only out for a week, so there's a little bit difference there. But at the same point, even if the dungeons are only out for a season, is this something that the players are just going to be like, why would I play this? Why would I learn this? What's the point in going in there outside of like the top end? Because the top end is obviously going to want those dungeons for score and whatnot. But like, is your average player just going to be like, there's no point in doing this dungeon, it's going away next season? And that's something you also have to factor in.
I mean, I think if it's part of the M plus rotation, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know. People will always play the dungeons that are... The problem with the Legion dungeons was that they weren't in the actual M plus dungeon rotation, right? It was a whole separate thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of just like, if you wanted to do it, then do it. But if they were to bring 4 of the Legion dungeons and put them into current rotation, everyone would be doing them.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, I do think that if the length of the season is short, like season 3 and season 4 look like they might be, then there's a little bit of a danger of like, I only had just kind of started figuring this dungeon out and it's gone again. But if we're on like 6-month, 8-month seasons again in Dragonflight, I feel like that is the perfect amount of time to keep things fresh, but also give me enough time to develop some mastery of those dungeons.
My biggest concern with all of this is that you remember season 1 of every expansion, and season 1 is always the time when, you know, Blizzard goes through a lot of iterations on the dungeons, and tuning all of the things, you know, getting the outlier mobs, figuring out the trash, because, you know, beta is just, I don't know, it's never good enough on beta because there's just not enough people testing it. There's not enough. It's always different when it hits live. Once it hits live, they get way more information. It's a lot easier for them to figure out where the problems are, and especially with all the different affix rotations. And that's when the meat of the tuning gets done. The concern is that every season now is going to go through this for the first month or two, and Blizzard is going to need to be very on top of it. Like, they're going to need to be very quick with all of the changes, because they got to get these dungeons perfect within a month or two so that we actually have most of the season to play with them well tuned.
To their credit, I do believe that they have been doing that, and like during
Tazavesh, Sanguine Depths, good examples of like getting dungeons into shape quickly.
I mean, dude, they were willing to slam like at the beginning of 9.0, they were willing to slam like multiple times a week just hotfix updates to dungeons to make them more, not even just like bug fixes, but like quality of life improvements, or just like buffing or nerfing mobs in the dungeons. And I thought that was fantastic.
I agree though with Ellesmere that like that's going to be super important in a world of like, you know, if a dungeon's only going to last for 6 months and not for 2 years, if it's bad for the first several months, that's much worse, right?
Yeah,
like my point isn't that they haven't done that. They actually did a great job in Shadowlands compared to previous expansions. You know, early on in Shadowlands, they were getting lots of praise because every week there would be a whole list of hotfixes for dungeons. But, you know, even 6 months in, 8 months in, they were still, even future patches, they're still making iterations on the original dungeons that were released in Season 1. So I think, I mean, you remember all the like tank changes in 9.1 with all like how hard everything hit. And I think, So, I mean, there's definitely, they did make a lot of changes straight out of the gate, and that was really good. But they also took longer to make some of the other changes. So my point isn't that they were doing a poor job. My point is simply that it's going to be really crucial that they are super quick and on top of it with getting these dungeons in tip-top shape really early on in the season, because these seasons are going to be so short and the content is going to be constantly rotating.
I definitely hard agree with Olivier, and I feel like a large thing is because we're getting these old dungeons, I would like to see more than just, oh, you know, this mob gets X amount of more damage, this one gets less damage. You know, because the tunings they've been doing so far is just fairly small stuff across the board. But I feel like if we're going to do completely old dungeons, we need to like change these up big time. You know, maybe change up the mechanics on some of the bosses, or add new stuff to the trash. Maybe even add new trash. I don't know if that's like too much to ask for.
Something that I actually thought would be kind of cool is like what would happen if they put Scarlet Monastery, like the MOP version, as a Mythic Plus dungeon. Like it's a really weird dungeon. It doesn't have a ton of mechanics, but I think like, and my concerns about replayability are high just because of what you cited, because like mechanics and like freshness, and it's just like not a modern dungeon. But at the same point, I do think that there are a couple of things that they could do to make that dungeon modern, and then like asset wise and by design, the dungeon is kind of cool, and it would be like a 15 or 20 minute key timer, which is something that I've never seen, and I would be interested to see how it play out.
Yeah, I think that a modernizing pass on these dungeons, especially the boss fights for some of them, would be really, really welcome.
Dude, I think it's less the boss fights. I think it's more the trash. Okay. There are infinite trash mobs that only just white swing on your tank. And like,
that's true.
This is fine, but it's like almost all of the mobs only white swing on your tank, especially in like Wrath dungeons. It's just like they don't have mechanics. They actually just only melee your tank.
I feel like, dude, this is kind of a tangent, but I feel like Shadowlands doesn't have enough mobs that only white swing. I feel like every mob has like 2 abilities that you need to, you know, interact with, or they'll kill you. And I feel like a little bit more just filler would be a good thing. But yeah, it shouldn't be like every trash pack is literally just autoing and getting AoE down. Yeah.
I think is what it is going to be.
I think part of the reason that they moved to that was because of the target cap on everybody, and the way that they kind of designed dungeons around wanting people to do smaller pulls. So if they wanted people to do smaller pulls, they couldn't just have, you know, a bunch of white hitting mobs that, you know, didn't really have any mechanics. They had to make every pack have mechanics that you had to interact with and deal with, so that way the small packs were still interesting. So I think that's kind of more of a design change that I would like to see back to sort of a larger AoE, bigger pull situation where you do still have those mobs, but you also integrate some of these white hit mobs like you guys are talking about that are less impactful, that you just kind of get to have fun with doing bigger pulls on.
Yeah, for me, it's like my like the most enjoyment that I get out of Mythic Plus is like one, the skill expression through routing, and two, the like just being able to own on AoE. Those are like the two most fun parts of the dungeons, at least for me. Like Toldagor first pull, I could leave the rest of that dungeon. I'm down to do the first pull over and over again. Same with like honestly, Necrotic Wake first pull, banger. The rest of that dungeon, you know, it's okay.
Not so banger.
Yeah, it's okay.
I would agree with that, but I do like to go into the whole point of like, you know, what I was talking about earlier, where it would be really nice if you did have specific routes that maybe specializes a bit more on smaller pulls. That way you're not just having everyone being complete AoE monsters, because you will just probably run into that issue where you just want every class to be a Destro Lock or every class to be a Survival Hunter.
Yeah, I think the amount of count that like mini bosses have given, it's been good that it's been like trending upwards, and I think that's a good way to get us to do like, you know, skippable mini boss pulls to choose to fight them rather than skip them.
Speaking of only being able to bring Destro Locks and hard AoE type of stuff, what are people's thoughts on Mythic Plus tuning similar to PvP tuning?
That's been the biggest things I've been wanting for the longest time. It's been such a big issue because they have clearly been designing PvE around raid, or not designing, but you know, balancing around.
Yeah,
like the Destro buffs, for example, that was clearly targeted towards raid when Destros were by far the most broken class in M+.
Yeah, Windwalker Monk.
I mean, there's a lot of different things that I think could be addressed really, really quickly if they had an M+ tuning system where, you know, healer AoE damage could be addressed in a heartbeat. You know, outliers from, you know, Destro Lock Survival Hunters, Windwalker Monks that are just blasting AoE while everyone else can't really hit that same level. Those could be addressed in a heartbeat, you know, and they can't right now because we don't have that system in place. So I would really love to see a system like that where we could get individual tuning for specs so that everybody could have more of a fair shot at being meta in M+.
I do think that part of it too, like they've been trending towards like aura buffs and nerfs a lot lately, basically since they were implemented. And I think that for balancing on AoE, those are normally like multi-step things that you have to change about a spec or a class to get them in a state where they're more balanced on AoE than other specializations in particular. It's not like you're not going to nerf Destro Lock by just nerfing Rain of Fire. That's not going to fix where they currently stand. And at the same point, it would probably just make them feel worse in Mythic Plus. But like, do they need an aura nerf? I don't think that that's actually the answer either. There's like a lot of nuance that goes into nerfing AoE on classes more often than not, I feel like, as opposed to just like if it's like strict underperforming, yeah, you can just aura buff or nerf it and it's fine. But I think that they have to be able to take like steps to change AoE in meaningful ways. That's not just an aura buff or an aura nerf for underperformers or overperformers.
Yeah, and the problem is you can't really do that right now without that system in place because those complex changes would affect PvE raid too much.
Yeah.
So that's why a system like that is so crucial for M+ tuning.
Yeah, also uncap outlaw. Free outlaw, please.
Dude, you've been hanging out with JPC too much, man.
The thing is,
you gotta uncap it.
I don't think they necessarily need to uncap outlaw.
You got it, please.
I know outlaw's gonna hate me, but I mean, like, why not just make them specialize in fighting 5 targets? There is no world where outlaw rogue should lose 5. Well, why not though? You know.
Okay,
like,
yeah, I'm
like that'd be fun.
If they were at least Biss at 5, then I would be okay with it. Yeah.
And they would be like, you know, very solid at 1, just not the best when there's 20 mobs. And I think that's fair. And you know, just make that Sherlock's not the complete best at every single situation. Make them pretty doo-doo in single target and make them like I think Windwalker before the buffs were a prime example of something that's solid. Their single target sucked complete ass, but they brought the AoE, right? So that's like you would bring them for the AoE. You wouldn't necessarily bring them because they excelled at every single situation.
How do you feel about Sub Rogue?
Sub Rogue should have been better on single target and less AoE.
Okay.
Because right now they're sort of more of an AoE class right now. Like I'm fine with them before. I like the whole design of having sub rogues who specialize in single target. it only becomes a problem when they're the best at single target while being able to do massive AoE damage, which was
Yeah.
sort of last season.
I really liked when they were just big funnelers and they just, you had these big AoE pulls, but you had these huge prio targets, and it gave rogues that niche to prio down those big targets well. The other classes AoE.
Although that should
Although
have
I
been
don't.
Feral Druid.
Now the Desterlock is the best funneler in the game.
True, and the best
Yep.
AoEer, and the best single target. Crazy.
Well, they're not the best single target, but yeah.
Oh yeah, but I mean,
They're pretty high.
Still pretty
considering
high.
Everything else.
It's not to a detriment, yeah.
All right, final topic before we close out our show: rewards, items. I think is the first thing, like power rewards, and we could talk a little bit about cosmetics afterwards. Does anybody have a soapbox they'd like to stand on to advocate for any kind of change
yes,
in
I
M
am.
plus reward itemizing?
I am the M plus ambassador. I am an anti-raider. The raiders are root of all evil. Everything is balanced around raid. Gear comes from raid. Also, hot take: trinkets are the worst borrowed power we have, and people love trinkets for some reason. Trinkets are straight up borrowed power. Think about it for a second. You get a different trinket every single patch, and it's hard locked behind RNG. It's hard locked behind certain bosses. It's like, imagine if you can only get Venfear by killing Mythic Jailer, and you had a chance to drop this epic Covenant ability that gives your DK a massive damage boost.
Sure, but is that more of a problem with loot
Oh, I
acquisition
mean,
or with?
I was going a little bit
Oh,
tangent, I
okay.
guess. But the whole point was maybe make M plus loot separate from raid. That'd be like, one approach to it. I know a lot of people would be against it because, they want people to be raiding. But I mean, like, PvP, for example, is its own end game, and I feel like M plus is its own end game right now. PvP has its own loot. I feel like M plus should too. If not, then how about just make it so that we're like 2 months in, we can up the gear from M plus. I know raiders always complain about like, oh, but we have to do M plus. It's not anywhere near the same as M plusers or PvPers having to do raid. If you're doing raid, you have to commit to a certain schedule, play with 19 other players, and you're just like forced into this situation. Whereas if you're doing M plus, it's like, well, why the hell are raiders complaining about doing M plus when you can literally just go into LFG, find some random group doing some plus 15 key that's not even that difficult, and you just get your item naturally.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that there is a point to like M plus gear being farmable, and I think that the solution is, like you said, gear levels should stay relatively the same compared to raid, but you should be able to upgrade your gear with Valor that is on a weekly cap so that you can't farm it infinitely. You should be able to upgrade it to the same level as raid. In my opinion, I don't see why. And I guess raid can still have that, like the last two end bosses that have slightly higher eye level so that they still have that unique thing. But I don't see any reason why M plus gear should be not upgradable to the same item level as Mythic raid gear, assuming that Valor is capped. So you can't just infinitely farm it.
Yeah, okay. I was about to say, so what's the gating here to stop you from just like to forego?
Yeah.
Like
I'd even be
gear
fine
upgrades
with
and
some
raid.
more. Like, I think one thing that the creation catalyst is kind of shit. Like, what if there was just when the creation catalyst or whatever equivalent system comes out that sort of frees up the whatever power of the raid. Like that's the same time that we let M plus now get you to all the way to Mythic instead of just halfway there.
Oh God, can we get some new loot every season for Mythic Plus? I'm tired of farming the same damn trinkets
That's
every
gonna happen
season,
with
bro.
the rotation, right? That's the upside of different dungeons.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I just don't like this farming IQD every season. This farming the same stupid trinket.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I also think it'd be cool to
items
have a way to target those items. The same way like PvP
deterministic loot,
gets. Yeah, like PvP gets their weekly cap of their conquest, then they can spend that conquest to buy items. I think M plus should have something similar where you can upgrade with Valor, but you can also like target a specific piece of loot that you really want from a dungeon. I don't see why that would be a problem.
What about being able to purchase raid items at some point? Is that too much to ask for? Because I mean, like,
Yes.
Well,
what if
that's
it's like
something that
let's
they're
I think
doing
with
in
season 4,
right?
yeah, that the way the season
well
4 is going to
from I'm
work.
saying from that's only from Raidville, right? That's like
Yeah, but
if
like
you're
you can
raiding, you get to
do.
buy more raid
Oh,
gear.
you're saying like use M plus Valor to purchase raid
Yeah,
gear?
yeah, like
Oh.
maybe after Hall of Fame closes or something, you can eventually purchase a
I
gel
think I'd maybe
weapon.
be down, yeah, for something like the several months in, because like I don't know. I mean, I feel like raid gear being exclusive and like really powerful and the best place to get gear at the start of the patch is
It's
good. But
too exclusive.
yeah, I do think that like I don't know, the second half of the season is a time where I wouldn't mind. First of all, just like raiders that are still on Mythic progression being able to actually start using that gear from those bosses to help kill the bosses, and then also for players that don't raid to be able to start getting those items as well.
I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I kind of disagree. I do think that you lose some luster and some prestige over just like, I don't say handing out mythic raid loot,
Right, just
but
like, oh, that guy's got a mythic jade. This must be so
I know.
cool.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
understand
yeah.
that viewpoint too, but like after some point, come on, man. Like it's already like halfway into the patch. Nobody really plays the game anymore aside from raid logging, and then they hop back onto the PoE season because the new PoE season began. And they're not even playing World of Warcraft anymore. Like maybe add more incentive to play the video game.
Okay, I don't know.
I do think it
but
would add
also-
more incentive, but yeah, I do think you would have a hard time convincing a lot of
Yeah.
the diehard raiders that was a good idea.
All right. Well, I think it is
Raiders have it all.
an idea. Yeah, I don't think we necessarily need to get like I think if just even some incremental improvements to M plus gearing would be very welcome. Don't need the whole thing. Just
100%.
yeah. And I think the teleports, the titles, the mounts, love those. Love the recolor. I love the way they changed the recolor. I think I'd love to see even more transmog sets, mounts, those kinds of rewards from M plus if there's room in the budget. Please.
Don't mind if I do.
Don't mind if I do. Anyways, yeah, let's go around. I guess in case anything I missed, any topics we missed. If anybody has like one last closing thought, one last plug that we didn't get to, feel free to throw those out now. But I think otherwise we've covered almost all of our topics. So yeah, last call for takes.
Let's see. All right, more balanced patches. That's a
Okay.
big one. Less RP in dungeons.
Based-
Less traveling around
based
in dungeons.
opinion, yep.
Those are the big ones. Yeah, we can't have dungeons where we go around waiting for bosses and walking around DOS.
Necrotic Wig Trash Gauntlet's got to go as well. Get that shit out of here.
And maybe more rewards for pushing higher and higher level dungeon. Because sometimes I do get people coming in asking, it's like, why do you guys even push past 15? It's like, why do you guys do M+? What is the point?
I think that for the glory
Yes,
is a good enough reason, but
Yeah, for the glory is
a little bit,
definitely, but yeah, I feel like there
a
should be a
cool
little bit
like
more
PvP
incentive.
style, mogs and stuff. Yeah, would be sweet too. A
Even challenge mode
Glad
was
mount.
nice.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the challenge mode skins.
For me, it's just more open concept dungeons. Like I think that going into 10.0, like if they create more dungeons that you can kind of route your own way creatively, it makes more sense. I think that those are the things that I'm really looking forward to. Like the just more open design by concept dungeons and giving players more agency over what they're pulling realistically.
For me, I think my focus is still on affixes and removing or adjusting affixes that prevent roles from playing their role. So like necrotic preventing tanks from tanking and having to kite, or necrotic preventing healers from being able to heal their tank. Spiteful preventing melee DPS from being able to be in melee. Inspiring preventing preventing everyone from being able to use their stops or CC, which is like kind of the core of outplays and M+. Those kind of affixes should be shelved and I think they should be avoided in the future. And then also just kind of just changing the feeling of affixes in general from what affixes do we have to deal with this week versus what affixes do we get to play with this week. That's kind of the shift that I would like to see in terms of design, from just purely punishing, frustrating to play around affixes to ones that are challenging but also engaging and fun, and in some cases rewarding, like Dorki was talking about.
All right. Thank you all very much for your time. Let us know in the comments what you think about all of these issues that we've brought up. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
Dude, this is an hour-long video.
Yeah.
I
We
knew it
love
would be
that.
long.
It was interesting
Yeah.
though.
I agree. Yeah, this
Yeah,
is
I
not
think
one that I
people will
minded
love it.
recording at all.